The day Ethan Brooks stopped going above and beyond was the day his entire department began to quietly fall apart. For 5 years, Ethan had been the kind of employee no one worried about, which in corporate America usually means you are either invisible or indispensable, and in his case, he was both. He arrived at the office at 7:15 every morning, a full 45 minutes before most of the team filtered in with their large coffees and casual small talk, and he left sometime after 6:30 p.m., long after the overhead lights had shifted to their dimmer evening setting. Officially, he was a Senior Operations Analyst at a mid-sized logistics software company just outside Chicago. Unofficially, he was the reason the department's dashboards updated correctly, the reason client reports went out on time, and the reason small technical glitches never escalated into expensive problems. Ethan understood the back-end systems the way a mechanic understands the sound of an engine. He could hear when something was off before anyone else even noticed a warning light. But because nothing ever seemed to break, Daniel Harper, the department manager, believed everything was running smoothly due to strong leadership. In weekly meetings, Daniel would stand at the head of the conference table, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms, and say things like, "Our processes are tight," or "My team delivered ahead of schedule." Ethan would sit halfway down the table, laptop open, already fixing minor discrepancies in a spreadsheet while Daniel spoke. No one questioned the narrative because the numbers looked good. Stability is easy to take for granted when you never see the effort behind it. Ethan had automated at least a dozen reporting tasks over the years, saving the company an estimated 20 hours a week in manual data cleanup. But those scripts ran quietly in the background, invisible lines of code doing invisible work. When a client once emailed at 9:48 p.m. about a corrupted file before a morning presentation, Ethan logged in from his apartment and resolved it within 30 minutes. The next day, Daniel thanked the team for their responsiveness. Ethan did not correct him. He told himself it was fine. That recognition wasn't everything. That steady employment and a decent 401k match were enough. But over time, the gap between effort and acknowledgement began to feel less like humility and more like imbalance. Performance review season arrived. In early March, just as winter was loosening its grip on the Midwest, Ethan walked into Daniel's office with documentation, metrics showing reduced error rates, charts reflecting efficiency gains, and a concise request for a raise aligned with market rates in the Chicago area. He spoke calmly, outlining how his responsibilities had expanded beyond his original job description. Daniel listened, nodding with a practiced expression, then leaned back in his chair and said, "Ethan, you're reliable. But what you do isn't exactly strategic. It's operational. Anyone with the right training could handle it." The sentence landed without drama, delivered in the same tone one might use to comment on the weather. Ethan didn't argue. He didn't point out that no one else on the team knew how to maintain the automation workflows or troubleshoot the integration scripts. He didn't mention the late nights or the weekends he had quietly sacrificed. He simply closed his folder, thanked Daniel for his time, and returned to his desk. Something in him shifted that afternoon, not in anger, but in clarity. For years, he had been operating at 120%, absorbing gaps, anticipating problems, protecting the department from its own weak spots. If his role was truly interchangeable, then there was no reason to continue performing as if it were not. The next morning, Ethan arrived at 8 a.m. instead of 7:15. He left at 5 p.m. sharp. He stopped scanning for issues outside his assigned tickets. He answered emails within standard business hours and no longer logged in from home. He did exactly what his job description required, nothing more and nothing less. And because no alarms went off immediately, because no one noticed the subtle absence of extra effort, Daniel assumed everything was still under control. What he didn't understand was that the department had never been running on leadership alone. It had been running on the quiet surplus of one man's unrecognized labor, and that surplus had just been reduced to zero. For the first 2 weeks, nothing appeared different on the surface, and that was precisely why no one paid attention. Ethan continued to complete every assigned ticket in the project management system, responded to client inquiries during standard business hours, and attended each scheduled meeting with the same neutral expression he had always worn. The difference was invisible but structural. He no longer ran preventative checks on the data pipelines every morning. He no longer reviewed other analysts' reports before they were sent to clients. He no longer stayed an extra hour to reconcile minor discrepancies that would otherwise snowball into larger confusion by the end of the week. At first, the changes registered as small inconveniences. A dashboard refreshed 15 minutes later than usual. A weekly performance report contained a formatting inconsistency that required a quick follow-up email. A junior analyst misinterpreted a data field and submitted numbers that were slightly off, forcing a revision. Daniel Harper noticed the friction but interpreted it as growing pains tied to recent onboarding. In a Monday meeting, he reminded the team about accountability and efficiency, speaking with the same confident cadence he used when quarterly metrics were strong. Ethan listened quietly, hands folded on the conference table, offering no additional clarification and no subtle corrections. By the third week, the pattern became harder to ignore. A mid-level client in Texas requested a customized data export that Ethan used to prepare automatically through a background script he had built 2 years earlier. The script still existed, but it required occasional maintenance and manual oversight, tasks Ethan had performed without logging them as billable hours. When the request came in this time, he followed the standard documented procedure, which involved routing the task through the general queue. The process added 48 hours to the turnaround time. The client expressed frustration. Daniel asked why it had taken so long. Ethan calmly explained that he had followed the approved workflow. There was nothing technically incorrect about his answer. A week later, an internal audit flagged discrepancies between 2 reporting systems that were supposed to sync overnight. Previously, Ethan would have detected the mismatch before sunrise and corrected the mapping logic before anyone opened their email. Now, the inconsistency remained visible until late morning, when a director from another department sent a message marked high importance. Daniel called an impromptu meeting and questioned the team about oversight. The room felt tighter than usual, tension not from conflict, but from confusion. Ethan provided a factual explanation about data latency and recommended a temporary adjustment. He did not mention that he used to monitor the sync manually at 6:30 a.m. from his kitchen table while drinking coffee. As March moved into April, the backlog in the ticketing system increased by nearly 20%. No single issue was catastrophic, but collectively they created a steady drag on productivity. Team members began working later to compensate for unresolved tasks. Ironically, the very culture of overextension that Ethan had quietly stepped away from began spreading to others. Daniel responded with motivational language, encouraging ownership and initiative. He still believed the department was fundamentally sound. After all, the core systems had not failed. What he did not understand was that the margin for error had narrowed dramatically. Ethan had once acted as a buffer, absorbing inefficiencies before they reached visible thresholds. Without that buffer, normal human mistakes traveled further and lingered longer. The structure was still standing, but the internal supports were no longer reinforced. And as the small cracks accumulated, it became clear that what Daniel had perceived as stable leadership had, in reality, been dependent on effort that was never formally measured, never formally requested, and no longer freely given. By mid-April, the strain that had once been subtle became measurable. Quarterly reporting season approached, the time of year when senior leadership reviewed performance metrics before presenting to the board, and the department's usual rhythm felt slightly offbeat. Ethan continued to operate strictly within documented responsibilities. He arrived at 8 in the morning, logged into the system, addressed assigned tickets in chronological order, attended meetings, and left at 5 in the afternoon without opening his laptop again that night. He did not rush. He did not delay. He simply worked at a sustainable pace. The difference showed up in the details. A consolidated performance report that once required minimal oversight now contained 3 minor calculation inconsistencies because separate analysts had applied slightly different formulas. In the past, Ethan would have standardized those formulas quietly before the document ever reached Daniel's inbox. This time, the inconsistencies made it into a draft circulated to directors. Questions followed within hours. Daniel called for clarification, his tone controlled but sharper than usual. He asked who had verified the data alignment across regions. The room remained silent for a moment. Ethan reviewed his own section and confirmed it was accurate. He did not volunteer to rework the entire file. Daniel assigned a small task force to reconcile the discrepancies, which consumed nearly 6 additional labor hours across 3 employees. Later that week, a long-standing client requested a customized integration update tied to a software patch scheduled for deployment on a Friday evening. Historically, Ethan would have anticipated the downstream impact of that patch and adjusted internal configurations ahead of time. Now, he waited for formal instruction. The patch deployed without internal adjustments, and by Monday morning, several client-facing dashboards displayed delayed metrics. The issue was not catastrophic, but it triggered concern because the client had a renewal discussion scheduled for the following month. Daniel spent most of Monday in back-to-back meetings, reassuring stakeholders that the delay was temporary. When he approached Ethan that afternoon, his voice carried a restrained urgency. He asked whether there had been early indicators of potential misalignment. Ethan responded factually, explaining that the deployment notice had been distributed on Wednesday and that no specific task had been assigned to him. Daniel paused, absorbing the implication without openly acknowledging it. The department's backlog climbed another 10%. Analysts who once relied on Ethan for quick, informal guidance now hesitated longer before escalating problems, unsure whether he would step in the way he used to. The culture shifted from quiet efficiency to cautious hesitation. Each decision required slightly more discussion, slightly more approval, slightly more time. In aggregate, the delays compounded. Senior leadership requested a performance summary comparing current output to the previous quarter. The data revealed a modest but undeniable dip in turnaround speed and an increase in revision cycles. Daniel presented the figures in a conference room overlooking the parking lot, framing the changes as transitional adjustments. Yet the executives noticed the pattern. They asked what had changed operationally. Daniel mentioned onboarding challenges and market volatility. He did not mention Ethan by name. Back at his desk, Ethan reviewed a notification from a recruiter on a professional networking platform. The message described a similar operations role at another firm offering a salary 15% higher than his current compensation and a formal recognition of automation expertise. He did not respond immediately. Instead, he closed the tab and returned to his assigned queue. Around him, the department still functioned, still produced reports, still answered emails, but the invisible margin that once protected it had narrowed to almost nothing. What had once been absorbed quietly now surfaced publicly, and the system, though not yet broken, was beginning to reveal just how dependent it had been on effort that was never officially part of the plan. The final week of April arrived with a sense of pressure that no one openly acknowledged but everyone felt. Quarterly numbers were due to be locked by Friday at 5 p.m., and senior leadership had scheduled a presentation for the following Monday morning. In previous quarters, Ethan would have begun pre-validating datasets at least 10 days in advance, cross-checking regional inputs, reconciling historical anomalies, and quietly correcting misaligned fields before they had the chance to surface. This time, he followed the official timeline. When the consolidated data file was distributed on Wednesday afternoon, he reviewed only the sections assigned to him. He submitted his portion before the stated deadline and logged off at 5. By Thursday morning, discrepancies began appearing across multiple regional summaries. A revenue projection for the Southwest Division differed by nearly $200,000 between 2 internal systems. A shipping efficiency metric in the Northeast report showed a variance of 3 percentage points compared to the operations dashboard. Individually, these inconsistencies were explainable. Collectively, they signaled deeper synchronization issues. Daniel called an urgent meeting in the main conference room. The atmosphere was no longer mildly tense. It was strained. He asked for status updates from each analyst, pressing for timelines and accountability. Ethan explained that his assigned sections were complete and aligned with the raw data provided. He offered a brief technical clarification about potential mismatches in source tables, but did not volunteer to rebuild the entire consolidated model as he had done in past quarters. The team worked late into the evening attempting to trace the origin of the discrepancies. At 7:30 p.m., several employees were still at their desks, eating takeout containers and refreshing spreadsheets. Ethan packed his laptop at 5 and left as usual. No one stopped him. By Friday at noon, leadership requested a preview of the final presentation deck. The finance director noticed the lingering inconsistencies and asked for a definitive reconciliation before close of business. Daniel felt the pressure narrowing around him. He returned to Ethan's desk and asked directly whether there were any undocumented scripts or manual checks that had previously prevented these issues. Ethan answered honestly. There were monitoring scripts that required routine oversight, and there were cross-validation steps he used to perform before distribution. He had assumed those steps were no longer necessary since they were not formally assigned. Daniel stared at him for a moment, the realization forming slowly. The department had relied on processes that existed only because Ethan had created and maintained them voluntarily. Without that voluntary layer, the official workflow revealed its gaps. By late Friday afternoon, the team managed to correct most of the visible discrepancies, but the process consumed nearly 30 cumulative labor hours and delayed final approval. Senior leadership noticed the inefficiency. On Monday morning, during the executive review, questions centered not only on the numbers, but on operational stability. Daniel assured them that improvements were underway. Yet the data showed a clear pattern of increased correction cycles and slower turnaround times. After the meeting, he called Ethan into his office. His tone was no longer casually confident. It carried urgency. He asked why these preventative measures had stopped. Ethan responded with measured clarity, explaining that he was performing the responsibilities outlined in his role and adhering to standard business hours. He emphasized that no sabotage had occurred and that all assigned duties were completed on time. The silence that followed was heavy not with accusation, but with understanding. Daniel was confronting a reality he had overlooked for years. The department's resilience had never been built into its structure. It had been sustained by unrecognized surplus effort. And now that surplus no longer existed, the system was operating exactly as designed, which meant it was operating with far less stability than anyone had realized. In the days following the executive review, the atmosphere inside the department shifted from tension to scrutiny. Senior leadership requested a formal operational assessment, something that had not happened in over 2 years. Calendar invitations appeared with titles like Process Stability Evaluation and Workflow Risk Analysis. Daniel spent long hours compiling documentation, outlining standard procedures, and mapping reporting chains. For the first time, the difference between documented responsibilities and actual practice began to surface in measurable terms. During a cross-functional review meeting on Wednesday afternoon, a vice president asked a direct question: what safeguards existed to prevent recurring discrepancies in quarterly reporting? Daniel outlined the official workflow, listing checkpoints and approval stages. When asked who verified cross-system consistency before distribution, he hesitated for half a second before answering that it was part of the analyst review cycle. No one mentioned that those verifications had historically depended on one individual's initiative. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his routine without deviation. He processed assigned tasks, maintained professional communication, and declined invitations to optional after-hours troubleshooting sessions. Colleagues began to notice the contrast. A junior analyst privately asked him whether he had a new job lined up. Ethan responded that he was simply maintaining balance. The recruiter who had contacted him earlier followed up with a detailed offer: a base salary increase of 18%, a structured automation leadership role, and defined boundaries around workload expectations. The position required relocation to another Midwestern city approximately 400 miles away, but offered a hybrid schedule and formal recognition of technical contributions. Ethan scheduled a preliminary interview for the following week. Back in the office, pressure intensified. A client renewal discussion in Texas was delayed after performance metrics required additional clarification. Senior leadership joined the call alongside Daniel, signaling heightened concern. Afterward, Daniel returned to his office and reviewed performance data from the past 12 months. A pattern became undeniable. Error rates had been lowest during periods when Ethan's workload unofficially exceeded his job description. As his effort normalized, error rates rose proportionally. That evening, Daniel drafted a proposal for restructuring roles to include formal cross-validation responsibilities. The irony was evident but unspoken. What had once been dismissed as operational and easily replaceable now required formal acknowledgement as critical infrastructure. The next morning, Daniel requested a private meeting with Ethan. His tone was measured, less defensive than before. He acknowledged that certain processes had relied heavily on Ethan's expertise and asked whether he would consider leading a formal initiative to standardize automation oversight. The offer included the possibility of future compensation adjustments pending budget approval. Ethan listened carefully. He appreciated the recognition, but noticed the conditional language. Budget approval. Future adjustments. Pending review. He asked whether the role would include documented authority and compensation aligned with market rates. Daniel replied that such decisions required executive approval and could not be guaranteed immediately. The conversation ended with polite professionalism. Later that afternoon, Ethan completed his preliminary interview. The hiring manager at the new company spoke directly about valuing operational foresight and compensating preventative expertise. There was no ambiguity in the language. By Friday, Ethan received a formal written offer outlining salary, benefits, and a clear title reflecting automation strategy leadership. As he reviewed the document at his kitchen table that evening, he calculated the numbers in practical terms: mortgage payments, retirement contributions, health insurance premiums. The offer represented not just higher pay but formal acknowledgement of skills that had long been treated as incidental. On Monday morning, Ethan arrived at the office at 8 as usual. He placed the printed offer letter in his briefcase and began reviewing his assigned tickets. Around him, the department continued operating under closer executive oversight. What had once been quiet friction had evolved into structured examination. The foundation had been tested and found thinner than expected. And while leadership was now attempting reinforcement, the realization had come late, at a moment when the person who understood the system most completely was already evaluating whether his future belonged somewhere else. By early May, executive oversight shifted from temporary review to active intervention. Senior leadership assigned an internal audit specialist to observe workflow efficiency across the department for a 2-week evaluation period. The announcement alone changed the tone of daily operations. Conversations grew more cautious. Email responses became more formal. Daniel scheduled recurring check-in meetings every morning at 9 a.m., requesting status updates on ticket volumes, escalation risks, and projected completion timelines. Ethan attended each meeting with the same composed posture he had maintained for months. He reported his assigned metrics accurately and without embellishment. When asked whether additional safeguards were needed to prevent reporting discrepancies, he stated that clearly defined ownership of automation monitoring would reduce risk. He did not volunteer to assume that ownership without formal reassignment. Meanwhile, the written offer from the other company remained folded inside his briefcase. He had reviewed it multiple times, calculating the implications of relocation, cost of living adjustments, and long-term career trajectory. The new role offered a base salary increase that translated to approximately $1,300 more per month before taxes. It included a defined automation oversight mandate and direct reporting to a director who specialized in operational resilience. The language in the contract emphasized preventative strategy rather than reactive troubleshooting. On Thursday afternoon, Daniel requested another private meeting. This time his tone was direct. He acknowledged that the department's stability had historically depended on contributions that were not formally recognized. He proposed an interim adjustment, a modest salary increase effective the following quarter, and a provisional title change to Senior Automation Lead, pending executive confirmation. The increase amounted to roughly 5%, significantly below market rate, but symbolically framed as progress. Ethan listened without interruption. He asked whether the role would include documented authority over cross-validation processes, and whether compensation would be reviewed within a defined time frame. Daniel explained that executive budgets were constrained and that further adjustments would require demonstrated improvement in department metrics. The proposal carried an implicit expectation: restore the surplus effort first, and recognition might follow. That evening, Ethan sat at his kitchen table again, reviewing both the external offer and Daniel's verbal proposal. One represented immediate structural acknowledgement. The other represented conditional appreciation tied to performance recovery. He considered the past year in measurable terms. He had reduced error rates by double digits. He had automated workflows that saved the equivalent of half a full-time salary annually. Yet recognition had only materialized once visible decline forced leadership to look more closely. The following Monday, the internal audit specialist circulated preliminary findings. The report highlighted over-reliance on undocumented individual knowledge, insufficient cross-training, and lack of formal automation governance. The language was clinical but clear. Risk exposure was categorized as moderate to high if preventative oversight was not standardized. During the review meeting, executives asked who possessed the deepest familiarity with the automation infrastructure. Daniel answered truthfully. Ethan's name appeared in the final summary as primary system architect. For the first time, his role was described in writing with precision. After the meeting, Daniel approached Ethan's desk and asked whether he would commit to leading a formal stabilization initiative. The request carried urgency. Ethan responded calmly that he was evaluating career options and would provide clarity soon. The sentence altered the balance of power in the room. News traveled quietly through the department that he might leave. Colleagues began asking technical questions with heightened concern, attempting to understand processes they had previously ignored. Ethan answered within reason, sharing documentation he had already created but refraining from rebuilding informal support structures. By Friday afternoon, he drafted a concise letter of resignation with a standard 2-week notice period. He did not print it yet. He placed it in a folder on his laptop and closed the screen. Around him, the department operated under scrutiny, attempting to reinforce systems that had long depended on invisible reinforcement. The difference now was that leadership understood the dependency. What remained uncertain was whether that realization had come soon enough to change the outcome. The following Tuesday morning, Ethan arrived at the office at exactly 8 o'clock, just as he had for weeks, but this time the folder on his laptop was no longer hypothetical. Over the weekend, he had signed the external offer letter electronically and agreed to a start date 4 weeks out, giving himself enough time to relocate and transition responsibly. He printed his resignation letter on plain white paper using the shared office printer, the quiet mechanical sound blending into the usual hum of the floor. At 9:12 a.m., he sent Daniel a brief calendar invitation titled Private Discussion. When he walked into Daniel's office 15 minutes later, he carried no visible frustration, no anger, only clarity. He explained that he had accepted another opportunity aligned with his automation expertise and provided a formal 2-week notice period. Daniel's initial reaction was silence, followed by a measured attempt at negotiation. He referenced the proposed title adjustment, the possibility of expanded authority, and the importance of continuity during the current audit phase. Ethan listened respectfully and stated that his decision was based on long-term alignment rather than short-term compensation. He emphasized that he was committed to a smooth transition and would document critical processes during his remaining time. The conversation lasted 23 minutes. By noon, human resources had been notified, and word began circulating through the department. Colleagues approached Ethan with a mixture of surprise and concern. Several asked whether the workload had pushed him out. He responded consistently that he had simply found a role that better reflected his specialization. Over the next 2 weeks, Ethan operated with structured precision. He created detailed documentation outlining automation scripts, data validation checkpoints, and cross-system dependencies. He recorded step-by-step guides explaining how to monitor overnight synchronization logs and how to adjust configuration files during software patches. He scheduled knowledge transfer sessions with 2 analysts, walking them through scenarios that had once required instinctive troubleshooting. The sessions revealed how much tacit knowledge had existed beneath the surface. Questions multiplied. What happens if 2 data feeds conflict? How often should manual cross-checks occur? Which client dashboards require custom formatting overrides? Ethan answered patiently, but the complexity of the system became increasingly evident. Meanwhile, executive oversight intensified. Leadership requested weekly stability metrics during the transition period. Daniel attended additional meetings with upper management, presenting transition plans and contingency strategies. The internal audit report was finalized, highlighting concentration of system knowledge as a primary operational risk. Ethan's departure date was now formally attached to that risk assessment. During his final week, a routine software update triggered an unexpected data delay in one regional report. Previously, Ethan would have anticipated the interaction between that update and a legacy configuration file. This time, he guided the team through troubleshooting steps without directly resolving the issue himself, ensuring they understood the logic behind each correction. The process took nearly 3 hours, longer than it would have under his former approach, but it demonstrated the learning curve in real time. On his last Friday, the department gathered in the break room for a modest farewell. There were store-bought cookies and a short speech from Daniel acknowledging Ethan's contributions to operational efficiency. The acknowledgement was genuine, but it carried the tone of realization rather than foresight. At 4:58 p.m., Ethan sent his final status update email, outlining open tickets and pending monitoring tasks. At 5 p.m., he shut down his computer, placed his access badge on the desk, and walked out of the building without looking back. The department remained standing, systems still running, reports still generating. But the margin that had once absorbed uncertainty was gone entirely. What remained was a structure now fully exposed to the weight of its own design, moving forward without the quiet reinforcement it had relied on for years. 3 weeks after Ethan left the company, the difference between documentation and experience became impossible to ignore. On paper, the transition plan appeared thorough. Process guides had been archived in a shared drive. Knowledge transfer sessions had been recorded. Roles had been redistributed across 2 analysts who now carried expanded responsibilities. In practice, however, the rhythm of the department shifted from controlled strain to reactive scrambling. The first significant test arrived during a routine month-end close cycle. A synchronization delay between 2 core data systems created a cascading effect across performance dashboards. Previously, Ethan would have identified the anomaly by reviewing early morning log summaries and adjusted a configuration parameter before business hours began. This time, the issue went undetected until nearly 10:30 a.m., when a regional director emailed Daniel asking why revenue figures were inconsistent with sales tracking software. By then, several client-facing reports had already been downloaded. Correcting the discrepancy required not only technical adjustments, but also external clarification, which consumed hours of coordinated communication. The team followed the documented steps Ethan had left behind. But the nuance behind certain decisions was missing. Minor errors multiplied under time pressure. Daniel spent most of that day in meetings, attempting to reassure executives that the department was stabilizing. At the same time, recruiting efforts to replace Ethan encountered delays. Qualified candidates requested salaries aligned with market rates for automation expertise, figures significantly higher than Ethan's former compensation. Budget approval became another internal negotiation. Meanwhile, workload distribution intensified for the remaining analysts. They worked later hours attempting to maintain output levels that had once been sustained by a combination of documented tasks and invisible oversight. In mid-June, a key client renewal discussion resurfaced concerns about reporting reliability. Although the discrepancies had been corrected, the client requested formal assurance of system resilience. Senior leadership escalated the matter, asking Daniel to provide a written explanation of operational safeguards now in place. The internal audit findings, once theoretical, were now being tested under real conditions. During a leadership review, a vice president directly questioned whether the department had underestimated concentration risk. Daniel acknowledged that reliance on a single expert had created vulnerabilities. The acknowledgement carried professional restraint but personal weight. Around this time, Ethan began his new role in a different city, settling into an office where automation governance was defined from the outset as strategic infrastructure rather than background maintenance. His first week involved formal planning sessions outlining preventative monitoring frameworks and cross-training protocols. His contributions were discussed in terms of long-term stability metrics rather than emergency fixes. Back at his former company, a second reporting inconsistency occurred within a 2-month span. While not catastrophic, the pattern eroded confidence. Senior leadership initiated a broader restructuring discussion, evaluating whether departmental oversight required higher-level technical leadership. Daniel's position, once secure, now existed within a landscape of performance scrutiny. The department had not collapsed in a dramatic sense. It continued operating, generating reports, servicing clients. Yet efficiency metrics declined, correction cycles increased, and the margin for error remained thin. What had once been absorbed quietly now surfaced visibly and repeatedly. The organization faced a simple but uncomfortable truth. Systems that depend on unrecognized surplus effort are stable only as long as that effort remains voluntary. When it becomes conditional or disappears entirely, the structure does not implode instantly. Instead, it reveals its fragility incrementally through measurable declines that accumulate over time. And by the time leadership recognizes the full cost of what was lost, the person who once held that knowledge has already built something stronger somewhere else. By the end of the third month after Ethan's departure, the consequences were no longer theoretical projections discussed in conference rooms, but observable patterns embedded in quarterly metrics. Correction cycles had increased by nearly 30% compared to the previous year. Turnaround times for customized client reports were averaging 12 to 18 hours longer than historical benchmarks. None of these shifts constituted disaster on their own, yet together they reshaped how senior leadership evaluated operational reliability. During a late summer executive review, the Chief Operations Officer asked a direct question about sustainable process ownership. The discussion moved beyond temporary patches and into structural accountability. Daniel presented updated documentation, cross-training initiatives, and a hiring pipeline still awaiting final approval. However, the data showed that stabilization efforts required more time and more budget than originally anticipated. In private, Daniel understood the irony. For years, efficiency had been achieved without additional cost because it had depended on one person's voluntary surplus effort. Now, recreating that stability demanded formal investment. The board approved funding for a new automation governance manager position, a role that mirrored the responsibilities Ethan had once carried informally. Recruitment began again, this time with compensation aligned to market standards. Meanwhile, internal morale shifted subtly. Analysts who had once relied on silent corrections now double-checked their own work more cautiously, aware that no invisible buffer remained. The culture matured under pressure, but productivity dipped during the adjustment. In September, leadership conducted a broader performance evaluation of department heads. Daniel's review reflected both his prior achievements and the recent operational strain. He retained his position, but oversight expanded, and certain strategic decisions were reassigned to a higher-level director specializing in risk mitigation. It was not a public demotion, yet it marked a shift in influence. Across state lines, Ethan was settling into a rhythm that contrasted sharply with his previous environment. In his new role, weekly meetings focused on long-term system resilience rather than reactive damage control. He led structured workshops on automation redundancy, ensuring that no single process depended solely on individual memory. When he proposed an early detection monitoring framework, leadership approved the necessary resources within the same quarter. His salary adjustment translated into tangible stability in his personal life, from increased retirement contributions to a clearer financial plan for the next 5 years. Occasionally, he received messages from former colleagues describing ongoing adjustments at his old department. He responded politely, but without regret. The department he left did not implode in dramatic fashion. It adapted, slowly, and at measurable cost. What disappeared was not merely a person, but the illusion that stability comes from leadership alone. It had come from unseen diligence, from early mornings and late evenings that never appeared on formal charts. When that diligence was reduced to the boundaries of a job description, the organization operated exactly at the level it was structured to support. The difference between perceived strength and actual resilience became visible only after the surplus was gone. In the end, the outcome was not revenge and not chaos, but exposure. Exposure of hidden dependency, exposure of undervalued expertise, and exposure of the quiet truth that systems built on unrecognized effort remain stable only until that effort finds a place where it is fully acknowledged. And once it does, the structure left behind must either evolve or accept the cost of what it failed to see.